And that does it for tonight's Asia Today. I'm Fiona Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Breaking news. What makes headlines today throughout the whole world, particularly in East Asia, is the impeachment of Madame Pyo King-hui. The judges in South Korea, our neighboring country, as well as the Congress in particular, decided to remove her from her office because of the scandal. Now, I'm not saying I'm sympathetic with this lady over the fact that her parents were both killed in political assassinations. This is indeed a big pity and tragedy for the family, the first family in the history of South Korea. Now, it seems other than other hurdles in politics, it's very difficult and bloody for women to be involved in politics. If you look at the political assassination of Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan, and in the neighboring country of Pakistan, former Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Kumaratunga, lost her husband and father in political assassinations by Tamil Tiger, the independence movement in this country. And Indira Gandhi, former Prime Minister of India, was also assassinated. Brazil's former President Rousseff was impeached ahead of the opening ceremony of Olympics. So politics seem to be very brutal in what amounted to be major black swans last year. Having said this, let's look at the economy of South Korea, with which we signed the FTA a couple of years back. And I hope the current public debates about whether Lotte should pay a heavy price for deployment of THAAD would affect our economy. After all, the two economies, China and South Korea, do enjoy a large amount of trade after the FTA. Tonight we're going to talk about the U.S. economy and its robust relationship with the PRC during the Trump era. So I'll see you later.
While President Xi is steering economic globalization towards greater inclusiveness, Donald Trump is promoting protectionism in the U.S. How will China-U.S. trade develop with these differences? Are there opportunities for both sides to create dialogue on economic cooperation? Premier Li said China's growth target for 2017 would be 6.5%, lower for China but still higher than global growth. Is the government being cautious or realistic? How will the new normal for the Chinese economy affect bilateral economic ties with the U.S.? Since taking office, Donald Trump has threatened companies with overseas production sites, scrapped free trade agreements, and talked of closing trade deficits. Could Trump's severe trade policies trigger a trade war between China and the U.S.? The media predict that China, Trump, and Brexit will dominate this year's world economic discussions. But what will be the core values for the world economy in the next few years?
In the two sessions of China's political season, the government described in its annual work report an updated plan for both domestic and overseas economic policies. U.S. President Donald Trump also outlined his plans for the U.S. economy in a recent address to the joint houses of Congress. His administration is moving towards deregulation and easing restrictions on big businesses in the United States. The world is watching closely to see whether China and the United States can open a new chapter in their economic relationship. To examine the economic cooperation opportunities between China and the U.S. and discuss the potential challenges, today I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics, University of International Business and Economics, Liu Baocheng.
Well, it is a critical time for the world to see more certainty and predictability. But Donald Trump seems to be moving in the wrong direction. So Donald Trump, let's get down to business and let's get down to common sense.
And visiting professor of Guanghua School of Management, Peking University, Zhao Chang.
America and China is the most important relationship in the world. Donald Trump must take that very seriously. A trade war between these two great countries would be a disaster both for them and for the whole world.
That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Gentlemen, based on the current new economic policies made by Beijing and Washington, how do you see the trade negotiations, or BIT? Do you think a trade war is imminent and inevitable?
Currently, the BIT negotiation is rather stalled because even many of the U.S. Policymakers do not know what Donald Trump is heading into, and China actually is waiting patiently of what Donald Trump is going to take the first move. So the benefit is very clear, but if Donald Trump continues with his protectionist policy, with the isolation policy, then China will have to change its strategy.
China is ready to negotiate seriously. We're going to get very realistic about the uncertainty of Donald Trump's presidency in the next 4 years if he would not be impeached in the middle of the term. However, do you think there's going to be an imminent trade war or a war of attrition between the two biggest economies?
I personally don't think there will be a trade war. There's always the risk of that, but I think it's unlikely because I think that actually what Donald Trump is doing is negotiating his position with China in order to try and end up with a better overall position for America. But I think that both sides know each other actually quite well. They've had the strategic dialogue for nearly 10 years now. And there's a body of knowledge on both sides, and I think both sides know each other's position. So,
what would be the major challenges in the way that prevent China from moving in the correct direction, and the other way around for Donald Trump?
Well, despite the possibility of continued working relationship, the tension of escalation is still there. So I think what really prevents us to move very smoothly, one of course domestic politics, particularly in the United States, and there has been a widespread concern whether the job is lost. Caused by China, and whether China is going to really control to a certain degree of the U.S. budget because China is the second biggest lender, and also that whether the U.S. industry is going to be able to return to the U.S. because China is dragging their feet. But the reality is really the opposite. Actually, China is helping the United States to really to move not only in terms of the consumers' living standard, but the United States government in operation.
What do you think should be the major hurdles and the multiple challenges lying ahead for the two economies?
I think that growth is always the big challenge for the United States, certainly since the crisis, and I think employment also. I don't think Trump's rhetoric before the election about China and about employment within the US shouldn't be confused with the post-election situation. We saw with Clinton, with George W. Bush, both made rude comments about China before they were elected in order to gain votes. That changed once they were in power and they became better educated. The same, I think, will happen with President Trump. The big challenge is always, though, jobs and growth. That's really, for both sides, the thing. And, of course, that's best solved by sitting down, negotiating with each other, coming to terms. The BIT, which you mentioned, the bilateral investment treaty, would be an excellent thing economically for both sides. And they should pursue that and make it happen.
Another important issue.
There's no question about the political will and sincerity on both sides to move forward to benefit their electorate and the constituency. However, don't you think the team of President Donald Trump is surrounded by those who are very hostile to China, like Bannon, Navarro, author of Death by China? Now, if you look at the advice of these guys, you get scared.
Yeah.
Do you have the same feeling?
I think there's much rhetoric and exaggeration of the situation. They just want to create themselves as a spotlight. But on the other hand, we also see a balance, within the team. And there
what do you mean
also,
by a balance?
I mean a balanced view. Yes, Ronald, etc. They are more on the say the conservative side, and there are also those business people who support the China-U.S. trade and economic relations. So, well, we could not really see a very clear picture of, whether they are going to have a concerted decision over, the China-U.S. relationship.
Well, so much for the opposition and the frustrations that President Trump may be facing at this moment. What about the opportunities in China? Premier Li Keqiang outlined unprecedented measures to be rolled out in his government work report in the opening ceremony of NPC. But what is it that may attract foreign direct investment, given the rise of commodity prices, labor costs, and all other things, particularly favorable and preferential policies for the SOE? That part is not very popular with the overseas investment here.
No, that's right. But I think China is a very big market, and a large number of American companies make a lot of money here. Qualcomm, for example, which makes the chipsets for 3G, 4G, and soon 5G, makes over 50% of its revenue just from China. GM, 30% of its profit comes from China, and so on and so forth. Apple, another example. So there are many American companies that have done and are doing very well here, and that will continue. They'll want to go on doing that. So it's a very attractive market for all sorts of companies, and they would like more access to the Chinese market. And I think this is the trump card in China's hand.
But we are doing more to level the playing field, and that means the golden days of the overseas multinationals are over. And we're going to achieve, for example, unification of the corporate income, and costs are rising very fast. So some of the overseas multinationals may consider proactively relocating their headquarters of R&D from Beijing, Shanghai to perhaps Mumbai, Hanoi, or capital cities of other low-income economies on our periphery. Do you think this is likely to happen?
Well, this is happening because
this is happening
because of the rising labor costs and also tightened environmental standard for those the industries that are heavily reliant on these two factors. They are moving away, but China really should not really regret on that, because China still stands for its superior position in the industrial cluster formation. Now, if you set up a plant in Shenzhen, within 3 days, you can put every piece together.
You know, I like your phrase of cluster formation. Cluster is indeed a powerful, competitive phrase.
Yes.
Well, what do you think of the implications of a cluster? Do you know cluster? If taking Dongguan as an example,
yes,
the infrastructure for whatever
all
product.
The factors of production, they can be pieced together. People, parts, the roads and transportation, logistics and finance, they are all there.
Yes, I mean, China has a number of clusters. Pearl River cluster, the Yangtze Basin cluster, the Bohai Rim cluster. These are all large clusters, and certainly the southeastern cluster of China has been remarkably successful in the last 10 or 15 years at creating massive value added. But most of that value added has gone to foreign companies and to consumers in the US and Europe. Japan and Korea and other countries, but those two in particular, manufacture a lot of their products in China. They're put together, assembled here, and then sent off to America. So little value of the value ends up in China. You mentioned earlier, though, a comment about foreign multinationals' day is over. I don't agree with that. Some multinationals, like Professor Liu mentioned, which depend on low labour cost and low value added, their day is over. But there are many, some of which I mentioned, like Apple, for example, and Qualcomm. Qualcomm's market in China is going to continue for some time. The Chinese will eventually end up being able to make those chipsets themselves for mobile phones, but they can't yet. They have to import them from Qualcomm. And, over time that'll erode, but I think that Qualcomm have got a few years left in this market. Apple, everyone's got an iPhone now, but they'll bring out some new product, and again, China will be an important market for them. So I think China's market prospects for foreign companies are still very strong if they have value-added products which the Chinese need and can't make themselves.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Liu Baocheng and Mr. Zhao Qiang. We're discussing opportunities and challenges for the most important bilateral relationship between the biggest and second biggest economies, the United States and China for sure. We'll be back in a short while. Please do stay with us.
CGTN shows you more, providing a fresh global voice you can trust.
And a different look at the world you won't find anywhere else.
We offer unparalleled coverage of Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
We present diverse perspectives on news and newsmakers from around the world.
We want to engage our viewers with stories that represent the complete picture.
We want to share with you ideas that matter to us all.
The stories, the people, the issues.
A new and balanced perspective.
CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back, gentlemen. What do you think of the issue of RMB, which is depreciating against the US dollar? Do you think this is a good chance?
Well, the RMB is moving spearheadedly, although with some zigzags towards liberalization and globalization, and that is also the firm goal of the Chinese policymakers. The widespread of Chinese currency manipulation is really ungrounded because it is really a managed float. And when the whole world is accusing China artificially depreciating, but while we have been liberalizing the currency and while we are connected with SDR, actually they have been losing the value, which means the artificial manipulation and deliberate depreciation is not really supported by reality.
Does it make sense for President Donald Trump to accuse China of being a grand champion of currency manipulation?
Not really, in the sense that he's meaning it. He's meaning that China's trying to drive its currency down to promote exports, and I don't think that's true at all. It might have been true 10 or 15 years ago, but certainly hasn't been true for a long time. China does manipulate its currency, but it actually the other way, and it's trying to stop it from weakening, which actually is in the interests of America and other countries who do trade with China. So he's completely wrong about that.
He uses the word of manipulation, and he seems to buy this idea. Do you agree?
Well, I think the right way is really management. It's instead of manipulation.
Governance.
That's right, or governance. Actually, I totally agree with Gail that you know, in the Asian financial crisis in 1997, and also in the financial crisis most recently in 2008, actually China stands very firm behind its currency value. That really is a responsibility showing to the world.
That's exactly right. So I think there's a lot of attention devoted to the level of the RMB, and most of it is either ill-judged or inappropriate. I think actually the RMB has behaved in a pretty rational way in the last few years and has been very well managed by the People's Bank of China.
Well, President Trump has rejected the idea of TPP, and Japan, of course, complained a lot. But what do you think of say, China's complaints? Because we say the trade deficit would only be effectively reduced should Washington agree to relax its grip on high-tech transfer. This is one of the areas where the United States would always cite national security as an excuse to prevent China from acquiring the advanced technologies in some of the sensitive areas, quote unquote.
I think that's only one solution. Yes, to open more of the high tech for China purchase definitely is going to help. And the other is really whether more of the Chinese investment needs to be accepted in the United States, because we see a huge imbalance in terms of bilateral investment. So that's why we call on a quick solution to the BIT. And so when there's more, made in the U.S. but by Chinese companies, so that's going to be a great reduction to the trade deficit that the U.S. has been blaming China on.
I agree. I think that America should encourage Chinese investment in the U.S., which rose last year, 2016, to over $50 billion US dollars, from a much smaller amount the year before. It's natural for countries to be concerned about their high-tech industries, and China is also conscious careful to protect some of its industries as well. And I think both sides need to talk and come to a rational solution, provide a level playing field about opening up their respective industries to the other, and that would benefit both parties.
Look, the Office of U.S. Trade Representative recently submitted a report to the U.S. Congress on trade policy in the year 2017, and they outlined a very important policy option. The United States prefers to bypass the WTO trade dispute settlement mechanism and would subject whatever to the domestic laws, and that gave rise to a controversial case here. This week, Chinese telecom equipment giant ZTE Corporation attracted widespread attention Tuesday evening when it agreed to pay a penalty of $892 million US dollars in a U.S. sanctions case involving Iran. That, of course, involves the national security, and it's also subject to the American domestic law. Do you think this will make sense in the choppy waters between these two biggest economies? Do you think China will yield to the domestic laws of the United States?
Well, WTO as a multinational trading system, it really helps the whole world in boosting its trade and economic ties, and it is the right place to settle the trade disputes. As a matter of fact, since China joined WTO for the last 15 years, the U.S. export to China has increased far more than the Chinese export to the United States. So over the ZTE case, I think now the U.S. has really been implementing its long-arm restriction, and because ZTE has certain operations in the United States, so they allegedly have such a restriction. But of course, ZTE can also defend its position in this multinational trading system.
China is and will be the fastest growing export market of the United States. Having said this, the United States also launched anti-dumping and anti-subsidy investigations to bar China from exporting our solar panels or tires of automobiles.
Fertilizer, you name it.
Exactly, you name it. In many areas, the United States adopted powerful trade protectionist policies. Do you think this would be harmful?
No, I think this whole thing about market economy, when the background to this, of course, is that when China joined WTO in 2001, they were allowed to join. One of the conditions was that they were recognized as a non-market economy for 15 years, and that actually expired at the end of last year in December. And according to the deal, which was signed in 2001, China should then become a fully recognized market economy. But the EU, Japan, and America are all, I think, a large 120 countries have acknowledged that. But the three biggest traders in the world outside of China have reservations about it. I think it's very difficult. The economics behind trying to work out the costs behind dumping and subsidy calculations are extremely difficult and contentious, and the whole thing is highly politicized. So it would be.
Is that because China was exporting overcapacity of steel products, for example, and President Donald Trump said in sharp contrast that he would call for American companies to use the U.S.-made steel in the production of their pipes. Do you think this is a highly protectionist? It goes against international norms.
I think there are two issues here, whether it's a political issue or whether it's an economic issue. Economically, if you really, become competitive for Chinese export, in the end, the American consumers or the distributors would like to buy. Why not? So politically, yes, you levy tariff on the Chinese exports, but in the end, you're going to hurt U.S. consumers, because if China stops selling because of the prohibitive tariff, then consumers will be deprived of the access to made in China. And if the consumers continue to buy, that means you're translating the custom tariff onto the consumer tariff, and then that's going to hurt particularly those lower economic bracket, because those people who support Donald Trump are mostly the lower bracket people, and they need to buy cheaper price and reasonable quality made in China.
I think that, globalization and in particular Chinese exports going into a European Union and China have been a huge benefit to Western consumers, something that's often forgotten. If China didn't exist, then prices in America and the European Union around the world would be much higher for lots of things. And that's not the case. So that's a huge benefit from globalization. What hasn't happened, though, is that politicians and governments in Western countries who've been affected by globalization, which has brought huge benefits, have not adjusted enough, have not taken account of changes in the situations of workers who've been displaced.
Yeah, in the most recent
and they need to do far more, both in Europe and America, to do that. That's really the big move behind, or one of the big moves behind Donald Trump's election. It's a big move, a big force behind populism also in Europe. So that's a big lesson from globalization. If it's we need globalization, it will continue. Politicians, though, need to do much more to look after people who are displaced, re-educate them, and help them.
In the most recent interview with the FedEx CEO, Mr. Smith said, well, made in China actually gave the benefit to each American household $13,000 annually for the cost saving. So I think that's very
President Trump
impressive.
needs to be educated as part of the learning curve. He's more presidential after giving
well, he had
the
to get
speech in
elected.
the Congress.
He had to get elected, you see.
You know, he always falls back on the use of Twitter, and that might be the most controversial part of his presidency. Having said this, Trump's government applied to the WTO to force the Trump government applied to the WTO. When necessary, they turn to WTO. When unnecessary, they bypass the WTO, the way they bypass the United Nations Security Council, to force Japan to open its car and agricultural products market. It also questioned Japan's non-tariff barriers to cars and high tariffs on agricultural produce, seeking the implementation of the bold reform by Abe administration. Indeed, in the Japan-U.S. economic dialogue earlier in mid-April, the United States strongly urged Japan to open the automobile and agricultural markets to further increase trade. Do you think Japan, which is the closest ally of the United States, will be yet another front of the confrontation?
Well, Japan always serves as a small brother for the United States in Asia. They assumedly going to benefit more from the U.S. backup. Actually, economically, they paid a huge tuition, from Plaza Agreement to now, the last even 20 years. So I think they need really to learn a lesson. They want to leverage between the United States and China and also Russia, between these big superpowers. Actually, they need to reflect on themselves whether they have the right stimuli to boost their economy, and whether they have the right type of open mind to be, a constructive player in Asia.
Yeah, I mean, you probably know more about Japan than I do, but I think that Japan China is very important to Japan. It's one of the most important trading partners, if not the most important trading partner. So the Japanese-Chinese relationship, I think, needs to be paid much more attention to by the Japanese. And I don't think they should just be in the business of relying on Big Brother to help them out. They need to create a constructive go-forward relationship with China, which also implies doing something about the thing that China's most angry about, which is what happened 50 or 60 years ago. And that needs to be addressed.
As you said at the beginning of the program, will be the hallmark to characterize the presidency of Donald Trump. And part of the uncertainty, I'm afraid, depends on the mounting tensions of the Korean Peninsula, where the PRK fired 4 missiles into the waters near Japan. That's likely to trigger a regional conflict. And in that case, all major economies will suffer beyond repair. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue during Liang Hui, the political season. of China. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello, you're watching The World Today from CGTN. I'm Jeff Moody in Beijing. Two supporters of the former South Korean President Park Geun-hye have died as a result of injuries sustained at a rally.